In the summer of 2000, a father and his only daughter went to touch the sky. He was a teacher who knew the Earth's secrets, and she was a young artist who wanted to draw its face. They drove west, towards the highest peak in Texas, promising to call from the top. The call never came. They vanished into the heat and rock of the Chihuahuan Desert. For 13 years, their story was a ghost, a cautionary tale the locals told about the unforgiving mountain. And then, a pair of hikers, miles off any known trail, found something impossible, a tent shredded by the wind, hanging off the side of a cliff. And inside, two skeletons huddled together as if they were just sleeping. Welcome to Minority Struggles. Wherever you're listening, this is where unheard stories are being told. Before I begin, thank you for being here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. It means everything to know we're telling these stories together. Now, let me tell you what really happened. My name is Eleanor Jones, and that father and daughter, they were my whole world. Let's begin. 13 years is a long time to hold your breath. For me, it has been 4,745 days of it, give or take. That's how long it's been since I last saw my husband, Samuel, and my daughter, Simone. For the first few years, I counted every single day. I'd wake up, draw a neat line through the date on a calendar in the kitchen, and whisper the new number into the still air. 312, 1095, 2190. It was a ritual, a quiet madness, a way to prove they were still real, that the time they'd been gone was a measurable thing and not just an endless black ocean. I stopped counting when I hit 4,000. The numbers had gotten too heavy to carry, their weight pressing down on my chest until I could barely breathe. I live in the same house in Houston, the one Samuel and I bought when we were first married, its bones now settled and groaning like my own. His geology textbooks still line the shelves in the study, their spines faded by a sun he hasn't felt in over a decade. I dust them every week, running my cloth over titles like Principles of Sedimentology and the Dynamic Earth. Sometimes I pull one out and hold it, imagining the strength of his hands, the patient way he would turn a page. Simone's last sketchbook lies on her nightstand, open to a half-finished drawing of our old dog, Buster, who died 8 years ago. The world moves on, you see. Dogs get old, friends stop calling because they don't know what to say anymore, and the silence in a two-bedroom house becomes a physical presence. It sits in Samuel's armchair. It sleeps in Simone's bed. Some days, it's so loud I have to turn on the television just to drown it out. The canned laughter of strangers a poor substitute for the voices I ache to hear. The day they left was a Tuesday, August 8th, 2000. I can still feel the humid press of the air that morning, thick and heavy like a wet blanket. Samuel was 45, but he had the boundless energy of a man half his age, a spark in his eyes that never seemed to dim. He was meticulously packing their gear in the living room, checking every strap and buckle on their new backpacks with the precision of a surgeon. He had a map of Guadalupe Mountains National Park spread across the coffee table, a thin red line marking their intended route up Guadalupe Peak. "See, Ellie," he said, his finger tracing the final ascent. He loved to teach, whether it was a classroom of students or his wife of 20 years. "This is the final push. They call it the top of Texas from here. You can see for 100 miles. All the way to Mexico." He was so excited, his voice boyish. He'd been planning this trip for months, a special journey for him and Simone before she started high school. It was to be a rite of passage, a way to show her a world bigger than our quiet Houston neighborhood. She was 14, all long limbs and quiet observations, a sweet, thoughtful girl who was just starting to find the edges of her own world. She came into the kitchen while I was making them sandwiches for the road, her own small backpack already on. She looked so much like him, same steady, dark eyes, same thoughtful way of tilting her head when she was listening. "Mama, do you think I'll be able to draw the stars from up there?" she asked me, her voice soft. "Dad says there are no city lights. He says you can see the whole Milky Way like a river of diamonds. I think you'll draw the most beautiful stars anyone has ever seen," I told her, tucking an extra bag of cookies into her pack as a surprise. I pulled her into a hug, and I can still smell the faint lavender scent of her shampoo. I held on for a second too long. A strange, cold flicker of unease went through me. The kind a mother feels for no reason at all. A ghost of a premonition. I dismissed it as soon as it came. Nerves. Just nerves. Samuel came and kissed me goodbye at the door, his hand warm on my cheek. "We'll call you from the top. I promise," he said, his smile confident. "We should be back in cell range by Friday afternoon. Don't you worry about us." I watched them get into his old Ford pickup, the one he loved so much. Simone waved from the passenger window, a wide, hopeful smile on her face that I have replayed in my mind a million times. I waved back until the truck turned the corner and disappeared from view. It was the last time I ever saw them. Friday came. The afternoon sun slanted across the kitchen floor, and the phone on the wall remained silent. I told myself they were delayed. The hike took longer than they expected. They were celebrating at the top, and Samuel, ever the teacher, was probably giving Simone an hour-long lecture on Cretaceous limestone formations. By Saturday morning, the excuses had worn thin. The silence in the house started to scream. I called the Guadalupe Mountains National Park Ranger Station. My hand was shaking so badly, I had to dial the number 3 times. The man who answered, a Ranger Thompson, sounded calm, almost bored, as if my panic was a minor inconvenience in his day. He took my information with a series of slow, drawn-out ahas. "Ma'am, folks get delayed out here all the time," he said in a slow West Texas drawl. "This mountain ain't a walk in the park. They probably just lost track of time or decided to spend an extra night. It happens." "My husband is a geology teacher," I said, my voice tight, trying to keep it from trembling. "He's an experienced hiker. He's prepared. He would have called. He promised." "Yes, ma'am," he said, and I could hear the tired patience in his voice, the sound of a man who had heard this all before. "We'll look into it. We'll send someone to check the trailhead parking lot for his vehicle." They found the truck that afternoon, parked right where it should have been at the Pine Springs trailhead. A logbook at the start of the trail showed Samuel's neat, familiar signature. Samuel Jones and Simone Jones. August 8th. Destination, Guadalupe Peak. Expected return, August 11th. They were officially missing. The search began on Sunday. For 5 agonizing days, they scoured the mountain. They used helicopters that buzzed overhead like angry wasps, search dogs whose barks echoed in the canyons, and teams of volunteers on foot. Every evening, Ranger Thompson would call me. His voice never changed. He'd list the areas they'd covered. The Bowl, El Capitan, the Devil's Hall Trail, in a detached, clinical tone. He spoke of the terrain as if it were the enemy, of the blistering heat, the rattlesnakes, the sudden, violent storms that could roll in without warning. "We haven't found any sign of them, Mrs. Jones," he'd say day after day. "No tracks, no dropped equipment, no shred of clothing. It's like they just vanished into thin air." On the 5th day, he called to say they were scaling back the search. The resources were needed elsewhere. The probability of finding them alive, he said, was now minimal. He suggested they were inexperienced, that they'd wandered off the trail and succumbed to the elements. He made my Samuel, a man who could read a topographical map like it was a child's picture book, sound like a fool. He made my daughter sound like a liability. "They're not on the trail, ma'am," he said, his voice final. "And this is a big, dangerous place. We've done all we can." And just like that, it was over. The helicopters left. The volunteers went home. The news stories, which had been brief and local, disappeared entirely. A black father and his daughter from Houston were gone, swallowed by a mountain in West Texas. The official story was written, a tragic accident born of inexperience. The case was closed before it was ever truly opened. I was left alone with the silence, the ghost of a promise, and the suffocating knowledge that somewhere out in that vast, empty wilderness, my family was lost. And no one was looking anymore. The call came on a Wednesday morning in late September of 2013. The phone rang, and for a split second, the old, foolish hope flared in my chest, the same way it had 1,000 times over the last 13 years. Maybe, just maybe. But the voice on the other end wasn't Samuel's. It was a man who introduced himself as Detective Miller with the Culberson County Sheriff's Office. He spoke gently, carefully, and my heart began to pound a slow, heavy drum against my ribs. "Mrs. Jones," he said, "I'm calling about your husband, Samuel, and your daughter, Simone." I sank into the nearest chair. "Yes," I whispered, my throat suddenly tight. "Ma'am, a discovery was made yesterday in the Guadalupe Mountains National Park. Some hikers, they were way off the marked trails in a very remote area. They found a campsite." He paused, and I could hear him take a breath. "It appears to have been there for a very long time. We found 2 sets of human remains." The world tilted. The familiar floral pattern on my curtains swam before my eyes. 13 years of suspended grief, of living in the gray fog of the unknown, came crashing down on me in a single, silent wave. They were gone. Not lost. Not living a new life somewhere else, as I had sometimes tortured myself by imagining. They were dead. The hope I hadn't even realized I was still clinging to a tiny, stubborn ember was finally extinguished. "We need you to come to Van Horn, Mrs. Jones," Detective Miller said softly. "There are things we need to discuss, and we'll need dental records for a positive identification." The drive to West Texas was a journey I had sworn I would never make again. The last time I had been there was for the search, a week of hell spent in a cheap motel room, waiting for a phone that only brought bad news. Now I was driving back into the heart of my own personal nightmare. The landscape changed slowly, the lush green of East Texas giving way to the stark, beautiful, and cruel emptiness of the Chihuahuan Desert. The Guadalupe Mountains rose up on the horizon, their jagged peaks tearing at the sky like broken teeth. I looked at them and felt nothing but a cold, hollow ache. That place had taken everything from me. Detective Miller met me at the sheriff's office in Van Horn. He was a younger man than I expected, with kind eyes that held a flicker of genuine sorrow. He wasn't like Ranger Thompson. He looked at me like I was a person, not an inconvenience. He led me to a small, quiet room and sat down across from me, a thin file on the table between us. "Mrs. Jones," he began, "I want to be very clear. The original assessment of your husband's case was lacking. I've reviewed the file. I believe mistakes were made." I just nodded, unable to speak. "The location of the campsite," he continued, leaning forward. "It's what's bothering us. It wasn't in a valley or a sheltered area where someone lost might try to wait for help. It was on a narrow, almost inaccessible ledge on a cliff face. Our recovery team had to use climbing gear to get to it. It's not a place someone would choose to camp by accident. It's a place someone would go to hide." He showed me photographs. The images were grainy, taken from a distance. A tattered blue tent, its fabric shredded by years of wind and sun, was snagged on the rocks, hanging precariously over a sheer drop. It looked like a broken wing. The tent was anchored to the rock with climbing bolts, he explained. "Professional-grade bolts. Does that sound like something your husband would have used?" "Samuel was a hiker, a geologist," I said, my voice hoarse. "He wasn't a technical rock climber. He respected the mountain. He wouldn't have defaced it like that. He wouldn't have had the equipment." "That's what we thought," Miller said, his gaze steady. "The official theory 13 years ago was that they got lost. But this, Mrs. Jones, this looks like something else entirely. This looks like they were either hiding from something, or someone put them there." He told me about the contents of the camp. 2 sleeping bags side by side, a small, rusted camp stove, 2 backpacks, their fabric crumbling to the touch. And inside, the skeletal remains of 2 people, 1 adult male, 1 adolescent female. There was no doubt in my mind. It was them. He said the remains were being sent to a forensic anthropologist to determine the cause of death, but he warned me that after 13 years in the elements, it was unlikely they would find much. The initial report from the recovery team was that it was a tragic accident. Maybe they had been climbing, fallen, and set up a desperate camp on the ledge, unable to get back up or down. But it didn't feel right. It was too neat and too strange. Why would they have climbing gear they didn't own? Why would they camp on a cliff face? I spent the night in another cheap motel, the hum of the air conditioner doing little to drown out the thoughts racing through my mind. The next day, I provided Samuel and Simone's dental records. The confirmation came 48 hours later. It was official. Samuel Jones and Simone Jones were no longer missing. They were deceased. I should have felt closure. That's what everyone says you're supposed to feel. But I didn't. I felt a new kind of pain, a sharp-edged grief that was somehow worse than the dull ache of the unknown. Because now, I had a question that was even more terrifying than where are they? It was, what happened to you up there? Detective Miller seemed to be asking the same question. He didn't believe the accident theory any more than I did. He promised me he was reopening the case, treating it not as a cold case of missing persons, but as a potential homicide. For the first time in 13 years, I felt a flicker of something other than despair. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was a grim, burning resolve. Someone had to answer for the silence. Someone had to pay for the 13 years they had left me alone in that quiet house, counting the days. The mountain had not taken my family. I was sure of it now. A person had. The weeks that followed were a blur of sterile offices and hushed, sympathetic voices. The world outside continued, but mine had shrunk to the four walls of my home. The telephone, my only link to the investigation, unfolding hundreds of miles away. Detective Miller called regularly, his voice a steady presence in the sea of my renewed grief. He spoke of forensic analysis, of soil samples, of the slow, painstaking work of trying to coax a story from bones and dust. The initial report from the forensic anthropologist was, as Miller had predicted, inconclusive. 13 years under the brutal West Texas sun and the scouring winds had bleached the bones white, erasing any soft tissue evidence that might have told a clear story. There were no obvious signs of bullet wounds or knife marks. But there was something. Dr. Evans found hairline fractures on your husband's left ulna and two of his ribs, Miller told me over the phone one afternoon. She said they're consistent with defensive injuries. The kind of person might get raising their arm to block a blow. He paused. She also noted a fracture on his tibia. It's not the kind of break you'd typically see from a fall. It's a transverse fracture straight across the bone. She said it would take a direct, significant force to cause it. Something like being struck with a heavy object. I closed my eyes, a horrifying image flashing in my mind. Samuel, my gentle, patient Samuel, trying to fend off an attacker, trying to protect himself, to protect our daughter. The official accident theory, already so thin, was beginning to shred like that tattered blue tent. A fall didn't explain defensive wounds. A fall didn't explain a bone broken as if by a deliberate, violent strike. But the true turning point, the discovery that ripped the last vestiges of the accident narrative to pieces, came from a place I never expected. It came from Simone. A few days after the forensic report, Detective Miller called again. His voice was different this time, charged with a new energy. Mrs. Jones, he said, we've been going through the items recovered from the campsite. We managed to salvage something from your daughter's backpack. It was wrapped in multiple plastic bags, as if she was trying very hard to protect it from the elements. It's a sketchbook. My breath caught in my throat. Simone's sketchbook. It was her most prized possession, an extension of her own quiet soul. She took it everywhere. Of course, she would have tried to protect it. It's in bad shape, he warned. Significant water damage. A lot of the pages are fused together. We have it with a specialist in document restoration. They're going to see what they can recover. But I need to prepare you. It might be nothing. I waited. For 2 weeks, I heard nothing. I tried to keep busy, cleaning a house that was already spotless, tending to a garden that didn't need tending. But my mind was in that lab with that book. It was the last piece of her, the last thing her hands had touched, the last vessel of her thoughts. Then the call came. Eleanor, Miller said, and the use of my first name told me this was different. You need to come back to Van Horn. You need to see this for yourself. I made the long drive again, my heart a frantic bird in my chest. At the sheriff's office, Miller led me to an evidence room. There, laid out on a sterile white table under a soft light, was the sketchbook. It was warped and stained, the cover swollen, but it was unmistakably hers. I recognized the small flower she had drawn in the corner. A woman in a lab coat, the restoration specialist, stood beside it. We were able to separate about half the pages, she explained gently. The ones in the middle of the book were the most protected. We've stabilized them, but they're extremely fragile. With gloved hands, she began to turn the pages for me. The first few were a wash of blurred graphite and faded ink. Then an image emerged, a drawing of a horned lizard, its scales rendered in meticulous detail. Samuel must have pointed it out to her. I could almost hear his voice, explaining the creature's adaptations to the desert. Another page showed a sweeping panorama of the canyon, the lines confident and clear. This was my daughter's eye, her hand. I touched my own fingers to my lips, stifling a sob. And then the specialist turned to a page that made the air leave my lungs. It was a simple drawing, a quick sketch. It showed two figures from behind, wearing backpacks, unmistakably Samuel and Simone, walking along a trail. But that wasn't what seized my attention. In the upper right of the drawing, farther up the trail, was another figure. A man. He was standing partially behind a large boulder, watching them. He was drawn with just a few stark lines, but the impression was clear. He wore a wide-brimmed hat that cast his face in shadow, and his posture was tense, watchful. He was not another friendly hiker. He was an ominous presence, a shadow on their sunny day. My hand flew to my mouth. "Who is that?" I whispered. "We don't know," Miller said, his voice grim. "But look at this." He pointed to the bottom margin of the page, right below the drawing of the ominous figure. There, in Simone's familiar, slightly loopy handwriting, was a single word, scribbled so faintly it was barely visible. Caleb. The name meant nothing to me, but it was there. A name, connected to a face she couldn't see, connected to a feeling that had clearly been strong enough for her to capture it on paper. This wasn't a random sketch. This was a record. This was testimony. My daughter, in her quiet, observant way, had seen something that disturbed her. She had seen a man watching them, a man who made her feel unsafe. And she had done the only thing she knew how to do. She drew him. She documented him. She gave him a name. I looked at Detective Miller, and I saw the same realization in his eyes. This sketchbook was not just a collection of my daughter's last drawings. It was a message in a bottle, a clue tossed into the ocean of time, waiting 13 years for someone to find it. The story of the lost hikers, the tragic accident, the unforgiving mountain, it was all a lie. A convenient, simple lie told to cover up a truth that was far darker. My family hadn't been lost. They had been followed. They had been watched. And the man in the wide-brimmed hat, the man Simone had named Caleb, was the key. He was the flaw in the story, the ghost at the feast. And now, thanks to my daughter, we had a name. The name Caleb echoed in the sterile silence of the evidence room. It was a simple biblical name, but on that page, next to that shadowy figure, it felt like an accusation. For 13 years, the villain in my story had been an indifferent mountain, a cruel twist of fate. Now, the villain had a potential name, and the story was no longer about an accident. It was about a man. I stared at the drawing, at the name, and a memory, fragmented and buried under years of grief, began to surface. It was from the first night of their trip. Samuel had managed to get a weak signal on his satellite phone and had called me, just as he'd promised he would. The connection was terrible, his voice crackling, full of static. "Ellie, can you hear me?" he'd shouted over the line. "Samuel, yes. Are you okay? Is Simone okay?" "We're fine. We're great. The view is, you wouldn't believe it. Simone is in heaven." He'd paused, and the tone of his voice shifted, losing some of its buoyant energy. "We had a strange run-in today, though." "Strange how?" I'd asked, my grip tightening on the receiver. "Just a local fella, on one of the less-traveled trails. Seemed angry we were there. Told us this part of the mountain wasn't for tourists, and that we should turn back." "Did you?" "Of course not," Samuel had said, a hint of his stubborn pride in his voice. "I told him it was a national park, open to everyone." He just glared at us and walked off. Gave Simone a bit of a scare, but she's fine now. Just a grumpy old hermit, I suppose. The call had broken up shortly after that. At the time, I dismissed it. A brief, unpleasant encounter, nothing more. But now, connecting it to the drawing, to the name, it felt like the beginning of everything. The grumpy hermit Samuel had dismissed was very likely the watchful shadow Simone had drawn. I told Detective Miller everything I remembered from that call. It wasn't much, but combined with the sketchbook, it was a foundation. He listened intently, making notes. A local who was territorial, he murmured, tapping his pen on his notepad. Someone who knew the back trails. Someone who felt ownership over the park. It fits a profile. The investigation shifted gears. It was no longer a passive review of old evidence. It was an active hunt for a ghost named Caleb. Miller and his small team dove into the park's records from around the year 2000. They looked for employee lists, volunteer logs, incident reports, anything that might contain the name. For weeks, they found nothing. It was as if the man, like my family, had vanished in a thin air. The breakthrough came from a box of old, undigitized records stored in a dusty annex building. A junior deputy, tasked with the mind-numbing job of reading through years of handwritten maintenance logs and minor complaints, found it. It was a tourist harassment complaint filed in July of 1999, a year before Samuel and Simone disappeared. A family from California claimed they had been aggressively confronted and threatened by an unofficial trail guide who told them they were trespassing on his land. The family had been frightened enough to report it. The name of the man they identified was Caleb Brody. And the park ranger who had taken the report and dismissed it with a note, insufficient evidence, likely misunderstanding. Ranger Thompson, the same man who had handled my family's case with such dismissive indifference. Suddenly, we had a full name. Caleb Brody. The file was thin. Brody had worked intermittently as a handyman for one of the park's concessionaires in the late 90s. He wasn't an official park employee, which was why his name hadn't shown up in the primary personnel files. He lived in a small, isolated cabin on private land that bordered the park, and he had a reputation among the few locals who knew him as a reclusive, volatile man who was obsessed with the mountain. He saw it as his private sanctuary, and he viewed tourists as invaders. The pieces were clicking into place, forming a chilling picture. This wasn't just a random encounter. My husband and daughter had unknowingly trespassed into the domain of a territorial, unstable man. Samuel, with his confident, friendly demeanor and his belief that the park was for everyone, would have represented everything Caleb Brody despised. The confrontation he described to me over the phone was likely more than just a grumpy exchange. It was a challenge to Brody's perceived authority. And Simone, my quiet, artistic daughter, had seen the danger her father had missed. She had felt the man's hostility, and she had recorded it. Detective Miller's team tried to find a current address for Caleb Brody, but it was like chasing a phantom. His trail went cold around 2001, about a year after my family vanished. He had sold his land, packed up, and left the area without a word. There was no forwarding address, no paper trail. The search widened, using national databases. They were looking for a man who would now be in his late 60s, a man who preferred to live on the fringes, away from people. It was a needle in a haystack. Days turned into weeks. I sat by the phone in Houston, living and breathing with every potential lead, every dead end. The hope was a painful, burning thing. We were so close. We had a name. We had a face, sketched by my daughter's hand. We just couldn't find him. Then Miller called. "We found him, Eleanor," he said, his voice low and steady. "He's living in a remote part of the Oregon wilderness. Off the grid, just like we figured. The local sheriff's department up there has him under surveillance. I'm flying out tomorrow to question him." I felt a dizzying rush of relief and terror. After 13 years, the ghost of the mountain was about to be confronted. The man who had haunted my dreams, the man who had watched my family from the shadows, was finally going to have to answer for what he did. I prayed that he would confess, that he would finally break the silence and tell me why. Why he had taken my husband and my daughter from me, and what he had done to them on that lonely mountain ledge. I wanted justice, but more than that, I wanted the truth. I wanted the end of the story, no matter how ugly it was. The hope I had allowed myself to feel was a fragile, dangerous thing. I knew it, but I couldn't help it. For 13 years, the story had no ending. Now, with Caleb Brody found, it felt like we were on the final page. I imagined a confession, a trial, a verdict. I imagined a moment where I could finally look at the man who had destroyed my life and see him held accountable. It was a fool's dream. Detective Miller flew to Oregon. I waited, the hours stretching into an eternity. I pictured the scene. A remote cabin, the tall pines of the Pacific Northwest a world away from the barren rock of the Chihuahuan Desert. I pictured Miller sitting across from an old man, showing him the drawing my daughter had made. I pictured the man's face crumbling, the truth finally spilling out. The call from Miller came late the next day. I answered on the first ring, my hand trembling. I could tell from the long silence on the other end of the line that the news was not what I had prayed for. "He denies everything, Eleanor," Miller said, his voice heavy with frustration and exhaustion. "He's a harm man. Cold. Said he never saw them, never spoke to them. Claimed he doesn't even remember them. But the drawing," I said, my voice pleading. "Simone's drawing. Did you show it to him?" "I did," Miller said. He looked at it and didn't even flinch. Just shrugged and said, "Lots of people wear hats. He's sticking to his story. He says he left Texas because he was tired of the heat. He's smart, and he's hostile." He lawyered up the moment I mentioned the words homicide investigation. The legal reality, a wall I had refused to see, came crashing down on me. Simone's drawing was everything to me, but in a court of law, it was circumstantial. It was a drawing by a 14-year-old girl, a girl who could no longer testify. There was no DNA evidence after 13 years. There were no other witnesses. There was no murder weapon. There was only the testimony of a dead girl's sketchbook against the vehement denial of a living man. "What about the complaint from 1999? I asked, grasping at straws. "The other family he threatened. His lawyer is already calling it irrelevant," Miller sighed. "A dismissed, unsubstantiated complaint from over a decade ago. It shows a pattern of behavior, but it doesn't prove murder." The rest of the conversation was a blur of legal terms and grim realities. Without a confession, the district attorney wouldn't press charges. There simply wasn't enough to secure a conviction. Kayla Brody was going to walk away. The ghost was going to remain a ghost. As a final, desperate measure, Detective Miller decided to interview the one other person who was there at the beginning, the now retired Ranger Thompson. He found him living in a retirement community in Arizona, a place of manicured lawns and artificial cheerfulness. Miller told me later that Thompson was defensive from the start, his memory conveniently fuzzy. When Miller pressed him about why the initial search was called off so quickly, Thompson became agitated. "We did everything by the book," he insisted. "They were tourists from the city. They didn't respect the mountain. They came out here unprepared, got themselves lost. It happens all the time." Miller asked him about the harassment complaint against Kayla Brody, the one Thompson himself had dismissed. "I don't recall every little complaint from 20 years ago," Thompson snapped. "Probably just some city folk who got spooked by a local. We had more important things to do than hold every tourist's hand." Then, according to Miller, Thompson said something that made the blood run cold. "Look, detective," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I've seen it 100 times. People like that, they get in over their heads. Maybe they had a fight. Maybe one of them ran off. You don't know what their story was. People like that." The words hung in the air. He didn't have to say it outright. I knew what he meant. He meant black people. In his eyes, we were not an experienced geology teacher and his bright, artistic daughter. We were just people like that, from the city, people who didn't belong, whose disappearance could be easily explained away with a shrug and a stereotype. He had never seen Samuel and Simone. He had only seen a category, a problem he could dismiss. His bias, his indifference, his lazy refusal to see past the color of their skin. It had given their killer a 13-year head start. It had allowed the silence to fester. The system had failed us from the very beginning. It had failed us in 2000, when a ranger's prejudice meant a search was cut short and a complaint was ignored. And it was failing us now, in 2013, when the cold, hard logic of the law meant a killer would likely never face a jury. The district attorney made it official a week later. The case against Kayla Brody was closed due to insufficient evidence. The investigation into the deaths of Samuel and Simone Jones was declared inactive, a cold case once more. The file would remain open, he said, but unless new evidence emerged, nothing more would be done. A dead end. After all of it, the discovery, the hope, the chase we had ended up right back where we started, in silence. Caleb Brody was free, living his quiet life in the Oregon woods. Ranger Thompson was free, living his comfortable life in the Arizona sun. And I was back in my quiet house in Houston with the ghosts of my husband and daughter. The world had moved on again. The brief flurry of interest was over. Justice was not coming. I had to accept it. But accepting it and living with it were two very different things. They sent my family home to me in two small, plain boxes. It's a strange thing to have a life, two lives that filled your entire world. Their laughter, their arguments, their smell, the weight of their hugs, reduced to something you can hold in your hands. I sat with those boxes on my living room floor for a long time, my fingers tracing the cardboard edges. This was it. This was all that was left of the man I had loved for 20 years and the child I had raised. Dust and bone fragments. We held the funeral on a warm, overcast day in October. It was a small service, just a few old friends and family who had stuck by me through the years. I chose a quiet cemetery with large oak trees that reminded me of the ones Samuel used to love. We buried the two boxes side by side in the earth. The finality of it was absolute. For 13 years, they had been lost to the mountain. Now they were lost to the earth. But they were home, and they were together. That was the only comfort I could find. The case was officially cold. The files were put away. Caleb Brody's name was just a footnote in a report no one would likely ever read again. The legal road had ended, and it had led nowhere. There would be no trial, no conviction, no man in a prison cell paying for what he had done. The justice system, with its rules and its burdens of proof, had no answers for me. In the weeks after the funeral, a different kind of quiet settled over the house. It wasn't the frantic, questioning silence of the last 13 years. It was a heavier silence, one of resignation. The fight was over. I had lost. One evening, I found myself in Simone's room, sitting on the edge of her bed. The sketchbook, which Detective Miller had allowed me to keep, was in my lap. I hadn't been able to look at it since that day in the evidence room. It was too painful. But now, I felt a pull to see it one last time. I opened it carefully, the restored pages still fragile. I saw her drawing of the horned lizard, the sweeping canyon. I saw the ominous sketch of Caleb Brody, the man who had stolen her future. I saw a quick, funny caricature she had drawn of her father, his brow furrowed as he studied a rock. And then I turned to the very last drawing in the book. It was the one she had been most excited to create. It was a drawing of the night sky. She had used a dark charcoal pencil to fill the entire page, leaving small, brilliant specks of white paper showing through for the stars. And across the center, she had drawn a magnificent, swirling band of light, the Milky Way. It was breathtaking. I could feel the awe and wonder she must have felt, sitting there under that vast, dark sky, a 14-year-old girl trying to capture the infinite on a piece of paper. This was the peace she had felt. This was the beauty she had seen. This was her moment of pure joy, right before the darkness came. Tears I didn't know I had left began to fall, splashing onto the page. This drawing was her final word. It wasn't about fear or about the man in the shadows. It was about beauty. He had taken her life, but he hadn't taken this moment from her. She had captured it, and now it was mine to keep. I closed the sketchbook and held it to my chest. And in that moment, I understood something. The law had failed me. The world had forgotten. But I had the truth. I had Samuel's last crackling words over the phone. I had the fractures on his bones. I had my daughter's drawing. I had her testimony, written in graphite and charcoal. Legal justice was gone. But there are other kinds of justice. There is the justice of memory. There is the justice of truth. And there is the justice of a story finally told. That is why I am here, speaking to you now. Because the system that was supposed to protect us, to find us, to fight for us, looked away. They looked away because we were black, because we were from the city, because our story was easier to file away as a tragic accident than to investigate as a complex and ugly crime. They let a killer walk free, and they let a hero ranger retire in the sun. They will not face a judge, but they will face this. They will face the telling. Caleb Brody, wherever you are, hiding in your woods, you did not get away with it. Your secret is out. Ranger Thompson, wherever you are, enjoying your retirement, your indifference has a name, and it is the murder of my family. And to my daughter, Simone, you were a witness. You left a map for us to follow. They didn't listen to you then, but they're listening now. Your voice was not silenced. It was just waiting. Your story, and your father's story, will not be a cold case file gathering dust in a forgotten room. It will be this: a testimony, a warning, a truth that will echo long after the men who wronged you are gone. Justice doesn't always come from a courtroom. Sometimes it comes from a story told so loudly and so clearly that it can never be silenced again. Thank you for listening. Thank you for hearing them.